All right, so again, I'm James Donahue. I'm a district silviculturist on the Rochester and Middlebury Ranger districts. Welcome to our Ecology, Timber, Fuels, Roads virtual public meeting for the Telephone Gap Integrated Resource Project. And I believe most of you are probably familiar with the Teams format at this point, and you've heard from a wide variety of specialists through the process. Tonight is kind of your opportunity to ask some focused questions with tonight's speakers, and we're going to do our best to answer your questions about the telephone gap landscape specific to our specialties. And there's going to be things beyond the scope of our expertise, and we'll do our best to follow up with you after the meeting if there's still questions. Just another reminder, we're going to do our best to be respectful and to do our best to answer your questions to the best of our ability. And we ask that you're respectful of the opinions of others. I'm sure we're all going to have some technological glitches, but please be patient with this virtual environment. And we're going to go ahead and take questions at our question and answer period using the chat dialogue. And we will have two moderators who will be answering or asking your questions to the presenters. So again, the agenda for tonight, we're going to revisit some of the resource presentations from that initial public meeting that we held. And I'm sure some of it's going to seem repetitive, but what we've tried to do is to simplify our presentations and just emphasize a few key points and bring in some additional information based on the comments that you've all raised following that first night. And then following the presentations, the remainder of the hour will be for question and answer. And we're also hoping that you'll submit field trip ideas and topics into the comment, as well as asking additional questions about the telephone gap landscape assessment. And then we'll wrap up by sharing our field trip meeting information that's scheduled on August 10th, specific to our resource area here. So contact information for today for the folks that you're going to hear from are myself, James Donahue, district silviculturist, Suzanne Gifford, the forest ecologist and wildlife biologist, and Dave Donahue, our civil engineer, and Lindsay Ray Sylvia, our fire and fuel specialist, is also one of the moderators tonight and available for questions. And just some additional reminders, there's going to be 3 upcoming field trips that have been scheduled, and there's, I believe, 2 more that are still unscheduled. The primary one of interest to a lot of you might be that we are planning a climate and carbon field trip or meeting, but that date hasn't been scheduled yet. So with that, we'll start with Suzanne Gifford. Suzanne, if you could take control.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. My name is Suzanne Gifford. I'm the ecologist and wildlife biologist for Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forest, and I'll be presenting on ecological diversity. This will be a recap of my presentation from 2 weeks ago for context. So ecological diversity includes, at a broad scale, the current forest composition and age class in comparison with ecological tendencies, the ecologically rare or unique features, and wetland habitat potential. Comparing existing vegetation to potential natural vegetation based on ecological land types. And the key takeaway is that the landscape is dominated by northern hardwood, 76% of Forest Service lands within the IRP, whereas a much greater proportion of mixedwood and softwood habitats is expected. This discrepancy is due to the history of land use. landscape scale clearing for agriculture, followed by abandonment and subsequent ecological. So these numbers differentiate between all the Forest Service lands in the IRP and the suitable lands, a term we use to describe forest land that is managed for timber production on a regulated basis. Lands may be unsuitable for harvest or management due to forest or congressional designations or due to resource concerns predicting a risk of damage from harvest activities, such as steep slopes or shallows. As expected, this difference between existing vegetation and potential natural vegetation is even more pronounced when we look only at Forest Service lands suitable for management, because in many cases, these are the same, more accessible lands that were utilized more heavily in the past. When we consider age class, so while those composition objectives apply to suitable lands in even or uneven age condition, age class objectives laid out in the forest plan are only applied to suitable lands in an even age condition, a smaller subset of the project area. These stands lack structural complexity due to types of management that have been applied. Age classes are divided by habitat type, since tree species and natural communities mature at different rates. So please refer to the landscape assessment document for the full version of this table. This is consolidated. When splitting these habitats types out in the telephone gap IRP, the mature age class is currently overrepresented with respect to the forest plan objectives, while the amount of young forest is below our objectives and the regenerating age class is missing from this project area. Again, these objectives apply to suitable even age stands only, and it bears emphasis that the old class is in reference to silvicultural rotation timeframes. These are not ecologically old forests and do not display old growth characteristics. At the finer scale, we consider the ecologically rare and unique areas. Calcium enrichment from bedrock has contributed to this being a particularly unique and biodiverse area. There are 3 federally designated ecologically special areas within the project area. The Cape Research Natural Area is a high-quality, enriched northern hardwood and red spruce, yellow birch, mature and old-growth forest. Blue Ridge Fen is a high-quality, intermediate to rich fen wetland community at high elevation, surrounded by late successional forests. And North Pond sits at approximately 2,500 feet elevation and is surrounded by a very undisturbed old montane spruce fir forest, a cold air talus woodland, and some calcareous seepage. In addition, the State of Vermont Agency of Natural Resources has recently identified more than 30 state significant communities of 17 community types. And finally, we have preliminarily delineated areas of late successional, structurally complex forests, which are predominantly on unsuitable portions of the IRP. In contrast to the old age class for silvicultural rotation on even age stands, these areas of forest are possibly many times older and have begun to acquire some old growth characteristics. However, our inventory is incomplete at this time. And last, considering our wetland habitats, wetlands and wet meadows are tremendously valuable for plant and wildlife habitat, water storage, flood attenuation, and carbon sequestration. Incredibly important as we manage forests through a changing climate. The state of Vermont estimates we have lost half of all wetlands statewide compared with the historical condition. Beaver, a keystone species for creating and maintaining wetland and wet meadow complexes and an agent of forest disturbance, was extirpated from this area for the fur trade more than 100 years prior to European settlement. They were reintroduced into Vermont in the 1920s and 30s. However, they may face dispersal hurdles in populating higher elevation habitat pockets, including those in the portions of the telephone gap IRP. We see opportunities to manage this landscape. Some highlights include that a strong softwood and mixed wood understories present opportunities to increase these habitat types on the landscape closer toward forest plan objectives and more in line with predicted site-specific ecological tendencies. We can also prioritize retaining softwoods, particularly in cool pockets where they are most likely to be resilient to a changing climate. Oops, sorry about that. Oak is currently a small but ecologically important component of the landscape. Stands with strong mature oak component present opportunities for management, including by prescribed burning or mid-story removals to encourage a regenerating cohort of oak. Regeneration harvesting presents opportunities to promote aspen, birch, and other early successional tree species to further diversify the forest landscape. We see an opportunity to document the high-quality late successional forest areas for their old growth characteristics and consider alternative designations if appropriate. Our focus on this portion of the National Forest highlights the opportunity to complete inventory, documentation, and administrative reviews to finalize And finally, we see an opportunity to conduct beaver restoration assessment tool modeling to evaluate this landscape for opportunities to improve habitat for beavers or consider the potential to implement beaver-based restoration techniques, such as small artificial dams, which mimic beaver activity on appropriate sites. And back to you, James.
Thanks, Suzanne. So again, I'm James Donahue. And I'm a district silviculturist, but I'd like to recognize and thank Jeff Tilley, our forest silviculturist and timber program manager, for presenting my landscape assessment summary while I was away. And I'm going to try not to repeat everything he said, but rather emphasize a few points and maybe make some connections to the questions that have been asked at the first public meeting. So a lot of interest seems to be on what we're calling old forests, and the fact that a large area of the landscape is currently older than 80 years of age. And old is obviously pretty qualitative, as Suzanne just kind of indicated, but in the forest plan, old is generally applied to stands that are exceeding an age of 60 years for the aspen habitat type, or to stands that are 120 years of age for northern hardwood. And by that definition, a lot of the project area would be considered old or mature forest, a slightly younger age class. And I know that a question has come up as to how this compares to the state, and I don't have an answer for that, but in the abundance of old growth and mature forests within Telephone Gap, it's similar to the abundance on the Green Mountain National Forest as a whole. And old forests are generally characterized by larger diameter trees, which isn't always true, and kind of ongoing mortality of individual trees. And as time progresses, these stands do develop more structural complexity. But old growth is a different term, and it actually has a special definition in the forest plan. And so that old growth, by the forest plan definition, is an area of 5 to 10 acres of forest that has escaped catastrophic or standard placing disturbance. And Suzanne actually just mentioned that we haven't yet mapped those areas in the project area. But to kind of help visualize how those stand ages look across the Telephone Gap landscape, we do have a map that's available on the public information website for this project. And on this map, the darker areas, the darker green, they're generally those areas that meet the definition of old forest. So they're kind of concentrated on steep and inaccessible places, which prevented them from being harvested more recently. The brighter kind of middle shades of green, those are more likely forests that reverted from more recent agricultural abandonment. And then the yellow, those kind of younger stands, they're usually more recent acquisitions like the Stanley Tool Land, or they're more modern harvests, like the Baker Brook sale that I mentioned on the previous slide. And I can't really indicate with my mouse, but in the northwest corner of the project, of the landscape, you'll see how some of the more mature or older forests have been kind of broken up by those harvests historically. If you overlay kind of our management allocations which we've spoken about, some of those older forests that you just saw on the last slide, the darker images, they're protected from harvest by either research natural areas or other management designations that preclude timber harvest. But in fact, most of the areas that are the oldest forests in the landscape are there because it's historically been inaccessible and would now also be considered unsuitable timberland. So they're not available for commercial timber harvest. So again, to overlay those two, the areas kind of in red are some older stands, or some of the oldest stands in the project area that also overlay with what is unsuitable timberlands. So the next thing I'd like to highlight is the abundance of high-risk species in stands across the landscape. If you read the landscape assessment, it's a term that I use and define. And I can appreciate the perspective that some of you have shared about the importance of standing dead wood and standing dead trees, especially how those are, structural elements that contribute to carbon storage and wildlife habitat. And what I would like to emphasize is that another way to consider that high-risk species is that they're also at a high risk of losing their ability to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, right? So across the majority of the telephone gap, large-scale mortality like that occurring from beech bark disease or what is expected to occur in the near future from emerald ash borer, it's not necessarily going to greatly reduce the carbon stored in those forests, but it will reduce the capacity of those forests to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, much in the same way that a timber harvest does. The difference between the two is that with a prescribed treatment, we have control over what regenerates in the wake of that disturbance. And without a prescribed treatment, we lose an opportunity to make those stands more resilient to future changes, especially with climate change that would further reduce the stand's ability to sequester carbon. And I do have a larger discussion on this in the landscape assessment if you do go ahead and read that. So of the desired conditions that you've heard before, the forest plan has set goals that would be appropriate for the landscape, including increasing the abundance of habitat types, just like Suzanne mentioned. One of which, red oak, is a habitat type that would be probably more adapted to future climates. Or we have habitat types that are at risk of transitioning to other habitat types just due to natural succession, like aspen and birch. There are also forest plan goals to increase late successional and old forests, moving more forests into uneven age conditions and maintaining a more balanced age class distribution. And achieving all these goals can't happen on the same piece of land, but this landscape assessment process has helped us identify areas that might be suited for one goal or another. So after reviewing the stand data and the preliminary determinations of suitability, you probably saw this before, I believe that at most up to about 10,900 acres of this landscape could be both suitable for timber harvest as well as have a compelling need for treatment to move them towards the desired future conditions in the forest plan. This could achieve a number of forest plan objectives, but one of the most important ones, again, is that harvests are an opportunity to alter structure and composition to make forests more resilient to disturbances, like invasive insects or diseases or to climate change. And something that was left off of my initial slides, but I think is also important to note, is that the goal of increasing late successional and old forests that's in the forest plan, we could use non-harvest silvicultural treatments to achieve those objectives. They would, could be a part of any proposals that come from our collaborative process to help increase carbon storage on the landscape or to create more complex stand structures that more closely mimic natural disturbances. And where treatments like this occur is largely going to be driven by the next steps of our integrated resource planning process. So with that, Dave, if you could take control.
Yes. All right. My name's David Donahue. I'm a civil engineer on the Green Mountain Finger Lakes National Forest. I'm going to present engineering and roads topic here. So within the project area, the existing infrastructure for transportation consists of a total of 12.31 miles. This consists of level 1 roads, which are closed in storage, and a couple of those roads, there's 2 of them. They're actually both used as trails right now, and I believe one of them is a snowmobile trail in the winter. And then there's a little like 6.79 miles of high clearance vehicle roads. These are 2-track high clearance road, and then there's 4.57 miles of passenger car. Example of that's Lefferts Pond, going out to Lefferts Pond, Chittenden Dam. So relatively small amount of roads that are Forest Service jurisdiction in the project area. Majority of the other roads are private or town jurisdiction. Just talking about some of the existing conditions in regards to the structures on the roads. We have 4 bridges, 5 major culverts. 2 of the major culverts are currently aquatic organism passage barriers. So we'd probably be looking to eventually replace those to something that was an AOP beneficial. But there's 3 major culverts, and the bridges are all are not barriers. So that's a good thing for the stream road crossing interaction. And right now we do maintain all the roads to the current maintenance levels. So moving forward, the desired future conditions is to achieve a minimum road system, which provides access to the forest for management activities, recreational opportunities, and utilization of the forest resources. There's a gap between the existing conditions and desired based on some recent funding allocations. We were able to perform annual maintenance on many, but not all the roads in the project area. And also there's the deferred maintenance costs are considerable higher than the appropriate funding. And some initial activities that from landscape assessment that were identified was installing proposing some gates on a couple of roads to control seasonal closures for mud season, end of snowmobile season, before the roads are dried up, and they receive a lot of damage from people driving out in the mud season, and open them back up when the roads are back open. Some aquatic organism passage structures on Forest Road 57, which is Furnace Brook, potentially those 2, and then road improvements and reconstruction. There's one area on Townsend Brook, Forest Road 394, potentially realignment because due to a stream slide and embankment erosion caused by some heavy rains we've had in the past. But also any improvements, reconstruction that would regard for Timber Hall roads or recreation sites or trailhead parking that we'd be looking at improving those areas to support other projects in the area. And and so now we got a couple pictures of this is a previous road, which Forest Road 64 was done on a previous integrated resource project. So this was a level 1 road that was used in the winter for snowmobile activity. So the top pictures show you kind of what it looked like before the project activity. So it's a snow machine trail in the winter, closed in the summer. And then we went in there and improved the road, improved drainage structures, and the pictures on the bottom are showing improved materials and surface materials of the road, and then compaction and drainage structures that would alleviate erosion and future stabilization issues. Looks like we're to questions and answers. So I'm gonna let James take back over.
All right. Thanks, Dave. So with that, we'll jump into the question and answer. Like I said, we have 2 moderators. So I think Lindsay, you've got the first question if you want to go ahead and ask that.
Yep, sure. Good evening, everyone. Alan McGonigal, one of your first questions, I'll read that out aloud for the group. Why would we need young trees? You don't understand that objective, and won't forests inherently mature over time? You had heard that the project area doesn't include old growth, but if we cut mature trees, they won't make it to old growth. How do we ensure we leave a pathway for forests to make it old growth forests? And what is the target for reaching old growth? And James and Suzanne, I'll hand that to you.
Suzanne, do you want me to start? I know there's a part of that would be good for you to answer as well.
Yeah, for sure. I can start, and then you can add. Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me hopefully I can hit most of that, if not all. Trees. So we value a diverse landscape. Diversity is key to resilience. Aspen and birch are early successional species that would disappear from the forest if there weren't openings created either by human or natural disturbance. which are key for a lot of species, a lot of habitat considerations. The new growth of these trees and plants is the most nutritious and the most palatable. So that becomes forage for a lot of our wildlife species. The younger areas tend to be denser in cover. It's hiding cover. It's key habitat for a number of species. We do value maturing forests as well. We have designations on the forest, including wilderness, the research natural areas that were mentioned, and other designations. And those forests will continue to age for sure and head toward old growth. Go ahead, James. What would you like to add?
Yeah, actually, you nailed the kind of silvicultural reasons for creating young forests, mostly for creating landscape resilience or regenerating species that need full sunlight or that have kind of short lifespans that require that kind of a more frequent rotation. But then on top of that, I believe there was a number from your presentation or your first presentation on what % of the landscape was like unsuitable timberlands, either by management or by otherwise. And I think it was like around 30 some odd % of the telephone gap landscape that essentially is going to be otherwise left to develop naturally into older forests. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
All right, thanks. Sean, do you have the next question for us?
Yeah, let me get to a question from Mark Nelson. It says, during the wetland soils and aquatic habitat meeting, the importance of mature forests was emphasized. We have a paucity of mature forests in Vermont and across New England. Given the importance of mature forests, why aren't all of them off limits to logging in this project?
Yeah, I mean, besides our forest plan objectives for creating a more balanced age distribution across the landscape, we can look at mature forests on the Green Mountain National Forest as not necessarily, as rare as they are as the state as a whole. And I know that this came up earlier, so I did run some numbers today, and if you again, age class, those terms for mature or old kind of correspond to different actual ages of stands depending on what habitat type they're in. And I didn't run this like the extensive HMU analysis that Suzanne did for the telephone gap landscape, but essentially, if you just look at the number of acres on the Green Mountain National Forest that's over 80 years old or 100 years old or 120 years old, those forests of that age are pretty extensive, just based on the stand histories for the Green Mountain National Forest, the history of agricultural abandonment and acquisition into the national forest. We have a large amount of stands in that age class. We actually have a greater abundance of stands over 80 years of age in the telephone gap landscape as compared to the forest as a whole. 85% in telephone gap and 81%. I can't quite read that either, Zach, so you're not alone with difficult to read slides. Does anyone have anything to add to the question there? I see.
No?
Without anything else, Lindsay, do you have the next question?
Yep. Next question comes from Glenn Ayers. Can you explain to us what your timber targets are and how those targets are drive the planning process in order to meet the targets that we must meet in order to continue to get funding? It's a fairly loaded question for you, James, as a silviculturist. And Glenn would also like to have explained how the retention of timber receipts influence the planning process?
All right, so there's kind of three parts to that. The retention of timber receipts influences the planning process.
Yes.
So in terms of our target, it's I believe, and Jeff can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's kind of stabilized at around 18,000 CCS a year. Hopefully I'm not too far off on that, Jeff. So how that relates to the funding of our agency, I'm not really an expert on that. I'm not a regional staff. The funding of our workforce could be influenced by that in terms of the number of positions we're allowed. But really, our staffing is kind of it's based on probably a lot of complicated things. So I'm sorry, Glenn, I don't have a good connection there between the two, but it probably is there's some relation there. In terms of how it influences our planning process, right now we've just completed the landscape assessment, which is just looking at what's out there in the landscape. What are the existing conditions? What does the forest plan call for in terms of goals and objectives, and therefore what are our desired conditions? We haven't really gotten to the point that we start talking about funding sources to implement those projects that will result from that planning process. Once, just kind of from experience, once you start to get through the planning process and move into the implementation phase, like once the decision has been signed and we start to look at how we're actually going to start implementing the work, then those retained receipts or different trust funds that we can collect timber receipts into, that's when they start to pay for some of those restoration projects or other projects that come out of the integrated resource planning project. But this early in the process, we're not talking funding at all for anything. Anyone have anything to add? Jeff, do you want to hop in there?
Yeah, just as far as the target and as affecting funding. So yeah, we do have targets for really everything that we do in the national forest related to recreation use and restoration work, wildlife habitat work, invasive plant control. There's a long list that we kind of maintain targets, and those are tied to tracking accomplishments and reporting accomplishments up to the Washington office, the regional office, and reporting out to Congress and the public. There are so like James says, I mean, they use that to some extent. I think to some extent that's used in looking at where there's needs and opportunities with funding. But if we don't meet targets, it doesn't affect our staffing level or our appropriated funding levels. We're funded based on the kind of more holistic basis, is kind of what we're trying to do here as far as managing the landscape. And as far as the retaining timber receipts, there are various ways that our authorities we have that allow us to retain at least portions of the of timber receipts, but by and large, the use of those funds is limited to restoration work. So like the stewardship retained receipts, for example, are entirely limited to restoration work. So that's invasive plant control, erosion prevention, that sort of thing. And then some of it is Knudsen-Vandenberg funds that are specifically earmarked for restoration work and reforestation work within timber sale areas. So a lot of that, we primarily those funds are put back to work on the landscape to meet our objectives, restoration objectives primarily. And there's just related, there was a quick question about targets, whether they're from the 2006 forest plan, and they are not. There aren't targets. There's some analysis about the estimated yield, but those aren't our targets.
Thanks, Jeff. James, were you going to say something else, or?
Oh, I was just hoping that I got the 18,000 CCF right. I was just hoping for confirmation from Jeff on that front.
Yeah, that's approximately right.
Okay.
So the next question I had from Bill Sayre, and I apologize if I mispronounced the last name. How many acres of the Green Mountain National Forest are designated for wilderness? To answer that, it's just over 101,000 acres, for about 25% of the forest. And how many acres are on lands on which there will be very minimal harvesting? And I guess that I would have to send that to either James or Jeff. And without having a, your idea of what very minimal is versus, otherwise, I'll just let our silviculturists sort of probably don't have the answer for the entire forest off the top of your head, because
I don't have that. We'll have to follow up on that one.
Yeah. But in the project area, I know there was a little bit of analysis on that, but again, without having a standard definition of what you consider minimal harvest, I think it's better to just follow up outside of this meeting. And then I could just go ahead and, I guess this one would be for Dave. Even if an improved road is closed after logging is finished, how long will it take for the road to return to its previous state?
It depends on the soil and the underlying, how wet the area is, but we have evidence. We've had some roads since I've been on the National Forest here in Vermont. Boyden Brook, the road was a major washout in 2008, 2011. Irene came through and washed out again, and higher areas of that road you couldn't walk through. It was so thick with small vegetation, like 1-2 inch. So you're talking 3-4 years there. It was pretty well grown up, and that was a open road that had road gravels on it. So that wasn't a closed road. That was actually a road that used to be open, but then was damaged by floods. We've had other instances where roads was closed for Irene again, and that was closed for 3-4 years. We had 2-3 inch trees growing up right in the middle of the road in the gravel with no scarification, nothing being put to bed. So in regards to level 1 roads, some of our level 1 roads are actually have been on old roads for many years and actually have been used for many years as snowmobile trails. So they are mowed in the summers to keep open. But in regards to, I don't believe, I'm trying to think if that answers your question, but also in regards to temp roads, I'd say those get scarified and put to bed, drainage regraded. So that would allow natural vegetation quite quickly, I would imagine. So 4 to 5 years, you imagine you'd see 1 to 2, 2 to 3 inch saplings growing up in them. That's what I've seen from my experience.
All right, our next question are on behalf of 3 individuals, and it has to do with the suitability of land management in suitable areas. And first question was about interesting in how a goal of 20% of the land being managed for logging came about. The other part of that question is how that 20% of suitable lands for management translates in scope to the whole project area. It seems that we'll likely fall short of being a suitable amount of early successional growth. So those are on behalf of 3 individuals: Mike Covey and James Comiskey, as well as Alan McGonigal. And James, or maybe Sean as well, or Jeff. hand that over to you.
I think that may just be a little bit of confusion. Let me go back to the slide, I think. So maybe it's this bullet about managing a minimum of 20% of lands that are suitable for timber production using uneven age means. Is that so? Basically, when you read through the forest plan, what that goal is getting at is that from a silvicultural standpoint, we generally have two main silvicultural systems that you can use. One is an even age silvicultural system, and the other is uneven age. There's a whole bunch of different actual harvest methods within that, or prescriptions within that. But basically, of the land base that we're applying timber harvest, the forest plan says that a minimum of 20% of that should be using uneven age methods, which include either single tree selection or group selection. Single tree selection is essentially a silvicultural system attempting to regenerate a stand at the smallest level, the single tree or just a few tree canopy level. So you're creating a very small openings in the forest. If you were like looking down from above, and the idea being that you're maintaining a relatively ideal distribution of tree sizes in that stand. The other uneven age method being group selection, where usually this is applying a larger opening or creating a larger opening, less than 3 acres generally. So from anywhere from like a ½ acre to 3 acres, let's say, but it's really more complicated than that, across a proportion of a stand in order to regenerate more species that need more light, more sunlight to regenerate. And so that's what that's getting at. I'm not sure how that relates to your original question, because it was kind of maybe not hitting at what that goal was really about.
And James, another part of that extended question was, is there a target for successional growth?
Yeah, when you read the forest plan, there's like a bullet there about increasing late successional and old forests. The forest plan language at least specifies that on non-suitable timberlands, so either lands that are precluded from management by the management area that they're in, or because we don't have the technology to harvest them without degrading the site productivity of that site, or that we can't regenerate that stand within 5 years. So that's kind of the categories of unsuitable timberland. And the forest plans, like, intent, I think, when you read the language, is that what becomes late successional or old forest is on those lands. So maybe that's the answer to the second part. And what percent of that is, here in the telephone gap, as I think was on one of Suzanne's slides previously, maybe on the first night, it's about 30% of the project area that would transition into either late successional or old forest, just by the language of the forest plan. But then it's probably ends up being more than that when you take into account riparian forests, which were mentioned last night. For example, like the 50 feet buffer along perennial creeks, that's a minimum buffer. It increases based on slope, and then a 100-foot buffer from wetlands. When you look at those areas, it becomes a much larger percentage of the landscape probably than the 30% just based on unsuitable timberlands and management areas.
Thanks, James. Next question, probably best for Suzanne. says earlier up in the chat, a point was made that a habitat crisis is looming if we don't cut down mature or old growth trees. Do you agree with that? If so, what habitats do you feel? Sorry, screen just jumped. Do you feel would be in crisis if the forests are left alone?
Yeah, so that's why I kind of hammered on some of those definitions pretty heavily, because I think it's confusing and it gets kind of technical and nerdy, but we have an old age class for silvicultural rotation, but no one is talking about harvesting old growth. The EIS for our forest plan identifies 737 acres of old growth forest. And even within some of those, you'll get some folks disagreeing that some of that may not be truly old growth. So those are all locked up in special management designations. None of those are up for discussion for harvest. And to clarify, that at this point in the project, we are describing the landscape. There is no proposal on the table yet. We are just talking about the opportunities that we see. I do agree that early successional habitat is very important as for wildlife, and the amount of early successional habitat has varied very widely since European settlement, probably reaching its peak in the mid-1900s when a lot of the agricultural lands were being abandoned, and that's what led to the current day forest being very similar in age. We've got forest-wide. This forest that's about average 100 years old. And so we do have a lot of mature forest. A lot of wildlife species depend on a variety of habitat types to meet their needs. And the further they have to move around to meet those needs, the more energy they're expending. So a diverse landscape is beneficial to the greatest variety of species and offers the greatest resilience as well.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. The next question is coming from Mark Nelson. And Mark attended the Wetland Soils and Aquatic Habitat meeting and said that during that meeting, the importance of mature trees, mature forests was emphasized. They say, we have a positive mature forest in Vermont and across New England. Given the importance of mature forests, why aren't all of them off limits to logging in this project?
So, thanks, Lindsay. I think that, I mean, the answer to that is largely that we are planning a project that's consistent with our forest plan goals and objectives. And I think we've kind of already reiterated those in terms of like what the benefits of a more balanced age distribution, or what would be the benefits of a greater percentage of the landscape that is in a younger age class, or that has been made more resilient to the disturbance. And just based on the land base, you can't achieve all those things unless you do harvest some mature and old forest. It's just not possible to achieve all those objectives without excluding them. To the point about the importance of older or mature forests along riparian areas, you know, that's very clearly articulated in the forest plan, and some of Jeremy's projects here on the north end in the past are really focused on increasing the amount of large wood in streams, and to do that you need older and mature forests along those streams. And so yeah, I don't think there's any one of us that would suggest otherwise, that it's incredibly important to have mature and old forests in a riparian or aquatic system, adjacent to aquatic systems. Okay, I don't know if Sean or Lindsay, if you're going to see this. There was a question about the percent of the Green Mountain National Forest that is that has been clear cut in the past, I believe. Yeah, that Bill's there. It seems like there may be misimpression that harvesting is synonymous with clear cutting. Could you clarify what the difference is and tell us how many acres of the 400,000 per year are clear cut? And then which species of trees and wildlife benefit? And I had kind of done a data dig when I first got here in terms of like how much of the forest has been cut over the last decade. And to the first part of your question, yeah, clear cutting I think is oftentimes what people might call a harvest, but in silviculture, the name of a harvest really means something. I kind of alluded to the uneven age versus even age. Clear cutting is a type of even age management. It's generally the type of harvest that has the fewest residual trees. There's almost nothing out on the site or very little left out on the site after harvest. And it is also designed to regenerate trees that need like full sunlight. While I think a lot of the perception is that it's what we always do here, it generally, and this is from our own data here, if you look at the past 10 years on the national forest, even age systems and 2-age, so it kind of combines the both, represents 0.5% of the national forest system lands on the Green Mountain National Forest. So of that 400,000 acres, over 10 years, we have harvested less than 0.5% of the national forest system lands with even age or uneven age means. And then if you remove the acres that are in wilderness from that, it goes up, right? Because the land base shrinks, but it still does not total more than 1.5% of the landscape. So I just want the opportunity to talk about that. And then I kind of mentioned which species of trees in terms of trees that need full sunlight. We call those shade intolerant tree species. There's probably a very large list of those. We can probably actually think of a lot of the trees that came in after agricultural abandonment. So many of the trees that may now be mature are trees that kind of benefit from that system. But in terms of the forest plan, some of the key ones are aspen and paper birch that would benefit from that. And then Suzanne, I don't know if you want to talk about, maybe you've already touched on the different wildlife that benefit from young forests, and that's kind of the same thing in some ways.
Yeah, we've touched on this a bit already, and we have a wildlife follow-up meeting next week, next Tuesday, where we'll get into it in more depth.
Good plug.
And James, this is connected to the question that you just addressed. While you have your land-based numbers up, the question from Bill Sayre is, how many acres of the Green Mountain National Forest are designated for wilderness? And how many acres of land on which there will be very minimal harvesting?
Yeah, that was the one I think Sean answered or asked that, and he had a more precise number. I said about 100,000 acres are wilderness, which is about 24% of the forest. And then I don't know that second part, and so we'll have to follow up on that. So can I just put in one more plug? So we are planning on having a field trip on August 10th. I'll just throw out that information here for people to take down. If you have already filled out that form that's linked to, and Sean, maybe you could post that link back into the chat now. But if you've already filled out that form, we're going to contact you and send you a reminder for this meeting. That's on Tuesday, August 10th. It's going to be, I believe, man, I can't read that either. You all can hopefully read that, but we'll send out a reminder. We have the meeting location kind of formed, but we don't have the follow-up stops set at this time. And so I haven't seen any in the chat, but what would be really helpful is for folks to talk about in the chat things they would like to see or topics they would like to discuss on a field trip. But please go ahead and bring, boots and field appropriate clothing, food and water for the day, as well as any medicines that you have. And if you can carpool, we'll try to pick spots that have a large parking area, but it certainly makes things more complicated when there's a lot of vehicles. And the same folks who have been talking to you today will be there. And go ahead and fill out that form if you haven't already, and we'll send you a reminder.
Okay, James, thanks. To the next question, what are some examples of how the downed trees will be utilized?
I don't know what that's referring to. Again, we don't have a proposal. I think maybe that's referring to the in-stream wood projects that I mentioned that we've done in the past, or that Jeremy has done in the past. And essentially that wood that they're falling trees into creeks that create kind of complex log structures that kind of mimic the amount of downed wood or wood that would naturally occur in those streams. So maybe that's what you're getting at. They're important for developing refugia within streams and retaining different gravel structures and size classes that benefit spawning and rearing. So maybe that's what your question was about, but that's really for Jeremy. And again, we haven't proposed anything like that. Lindsay or?
Yep. So I do see one from M. Batten, and Suzanne, I think this might fall in your wheelhouse as an ecologist. And the question is, can you explain how logging helps the forest to be more resilient in terms of the impending climate crisis? Certainly, James, you as well, but Suzanne, I figured that may be something in the overall ecological component.
Suzanne, do you want me to hop on that?
Sure, go for it.
I have a couple slides here kind of prepared. I wonder how this is going to work. But basically, one of the tools that we have as an agency is a good visualizer for the climate that we can expect in the future, just based on our understanding of the carbon that we've emitted and how our understanding of global climate models. They can downscale some of that information that to a kind of at the forest level show us what the impacts are going to be. One of those impacts is that, well, there's a whole lot of resources out there. We have a New England, I can't remember what it's called now, but we have essentially a vulnerability assessment for all the forests in New England that kind of talks more in regards to what we are expecting to happen ecologically with a changing climate. But this model, I think, illustrates it really well. So there's a point here that is within the project area, and I've kind of filled in some information about what am I trying to project into the future. And the model essentially shows me where, if I want to go gather seed to plant in that spot that I gave it, that will be adapted to the climate that I put into this model, it shows me areas that will have essentially the genetic properties that make them more adapted to that future climate. So our little point here around the Chittenden Reservoir, basically, if I want to go find seed now that is adapted to the climate that we will have at the end of the century, we're going to need to go down to like Newark, New Jersey, or the George Washington National Forest or the Monongahela National Forest to find that seed. So essentially you can think of this as our climate at the end of the century is going to be like those places. And if our climate is like those places, one could suggest that the forest would look like those places. So harvesting is basically a way to either plant, like we've done this on the forest, in harvest, we've planted trees that maybe are of a species that is better adapted to the future climate, such as red oak. That's one that we did in the Robinson planting area. So that's one way. The other way is harvesting can remove those species that maybe not adapted to that future climate or may be predisposed to insects and diseases that are expected to be exacerbated by climate change. You know, hemlock woolly adelgid is one of those examples of a pest that is moving as the climate is warming. So that kind of just gets at the surface, I think, and that'll be probably more the focus of that follow-up carbon and climate meeting. And we've exceeded our time, and clearly there's still a lot of questions out there, but I do want to thank you all for participating tonight. And again, there's going to be more opportunities to have discussions in the field. So please do plan on attending that field trip and the follow-up meetings. And again, Sean is going to make every effort to follow up with folks whose questions were unanswered. But I'd like to thank Lindsay and Sean for being our moderators tonight, and Suzanne and Dave for presenting. And anyone have any other final comments from the panel here?
No, I don't have anything, James. Like James said, I will, you know, these meetings are recorded and we're capturing all the chat comments. And I will do my best to follow up on anything we may have missed tonight, either myself or I will forward any questions that require more expertise that I don't have onto other folks. Okay, and with that, I will hand it over to James and we can kind of call it good, and hopefully we'll see you all, many of you at the field trip. And
all right, sounds good. Everyone have a good night. Thank you so much.
thanks.
Bye.